My name is Dr. Jacob J. Schacter. I am University Professor of Jewish History and Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University, and I'm a member of the steering committee of the Emil and Jenny A. Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva. It's a great privilege for me to participate in this conference that's sponsored by the Fish Center. The subject, Jewish Responses to the Holocaust. My subject, Jewish religious responses to the Holocaust. The focus of this conference and of my lecture is on responses during the Holocaust, not after the Holocaust. Obviously, that subject is very important, and I have no doubt that it will be the topic of future conferences sponsored by the Fish Center. As one would logically expect, the Jewish religious responses to the Holocaust, while it was unfolding, took various forms, from those who were formally observant and committed to absolutely rejecting God and their connection with Jewish tradition based on what they and their loved ones had already experienced even during the Holocaust, moving to questioning and even challenging God, but somehow still remaining part of the community, and then finally to ongoing continued faith, solid commitment to God and religious observance in spite of what they and their loved ones had already experienced. I am going to base my remarks on printed records and sources, and you will see available to you the bibliography of the books that I consulted in preparing this lecture, and also on one website, and I will come back to that shortly. I also will include unpublished first-person testimony that I heard from my late father, Rabbi Schacter, who was one of the first American Jewish chaplains to enter into concentration camps after the war. In his case, the Buchenwald concentration camp that he entered on April 11th, 1945. He told me and spoke often about his experiences, shared stories, and I will draw on them as well. First, one can clearly understand, and obviously not judge for a second, why someone who experienced the horrors of the Holocaust, even while it was still going on, would find it not only challenging, but even impossible to maintain one's faith in God and one's religious commitments in the face of what they had already seen. In 1941, Einig Shabbos, which was a clandestine archival society founded by Emanuel Ringelblum in Warsaw, sent out a questionnaire to leading Jewish personalities, asking them to weigh in and to respond to all kinds of questions regarding what was going on in Jewish life at that time. They sent one to Hillel Zeitlin, who was a writer and a philosopher. And the question was as follows: how can you explain the decline and weakening of religious life in the ghetto? So they asked Zeitlin, and they asked a number of others, to explain what they saw in front of them. They already recognized that there was a decline and weakening of religious life in the ghetto. And in his response, Zeitlin wrote the following: "It is unfortunately a sorrowful fact that religious life in the ghetto has declined considerably. The Sabbath is vanishing. Of the 220 families in the building where I live, barely 2 or 3 observe the Sabbath." I'm assuming that many more observed the Sabbath before the war. "Characteristic is the rebellion against God, against heaven, which is noticeable among many religious Jews who no longer wish to declare that God's judgment is right." So there is evidence, and we would expect to find evidence of Jews, formerly seriously committed, observant, engaged Jews, who just gave up, could not understand how God could be doing what they understood God was doing, God who runs the world. I want to bring a second piece of evidence from an iconic rabbinic Hasidic figure in the Warsaw Ghetto at this time, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, known as the Piaseczna Rebbe. He was the son of a very distinguished Hasidic family. Early on, when he was 20, he became a rabbi, a rebbe in Piaseczna. It's a little bit outside of Warsaw. He founded a yeshiva. He was very, very well known for his pedagogic methodology. His yeshiva became one of the largest in Poland between the two world wars. He moved to Warsaw as the war began to loom and was immediately struck with just unspeakable tragedy. His only son, his daughter-in-law, and his sister-in-law were killed during a Nazi aerial bombing of Warsaw in September of 1939. The ghetto began. He was interned in the ghetto with his Hasidim. He ran a secret synagogue, and he invested an enormous amount of time and energy in trying to keep the faith of the Jews alive. He delivered weekly sermons to his Hasidim, trying to give them chizuk, to give them strength to maintain their faith. He wrote them down, and when things got very difficult, he transferred the book and manuscripts to the Einig Shabbos archive, buried with other documents in a large milk canister found remarkably, maybe miraculously, by a construction worker after the war. There was a little letter on the top. If somebody finds this, please send it to my brother who's living in Israel. They were sent to Israel. They were published in 1960 in Hebrew for the first time, and only in 2017 were republished in a much more correct and sophisticated edition. After the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was crushed, Rabbi Shapiro was taken to work in Lublin. He had opportunities to escape. He didn't escape. An Aktion was launched there against the Jews in November of 1943, and he was shot to death. He was legendary before the war as an educator, and during the war as an enormous source of strength. He was an extraordinary hero, a larger-than-life personality, and left a larger-than-life reputation. You have a picture of him that I produced for you. You get a sense of what it was that he looked like. And in December of 1941, relatively towards the beginning, he already noted in a text before you, "To our grief, we see that even amongst those whose belief was always wholehearted, there are now certain individuals whose faith has been damaged. They question God, asking, 'Why have you forsaken us?' In Hebrew, Lama Azavtani. If we are being tortured in order to bring us closer to Torah and worship," they argue, which itself was hard for them to understand, "then why, on the contrary, is the Torah and everything that is holy also being destroyed?" And so the first category, Jewish religious responses to the Holocaust while it was unfolding. I used to believe I was all in, but I can't. I don't understand how God behaves. I want to move now to the second perspective along the spectrum, and that is challenging God, but still not rejecting. My late father ran a service, a religious service in the Buchenwald concentration camp shortly after he arrived. It's a very, very famous service because it is the object of a picture that was taken by someone that became very, very public. If one travels to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel in Jerusalem, on the way out in the Liberator section, it occupies an entire wall, maybe 20 or 30 feet on the wall, a picture of my father leading this service. When my father died in 2013, his obituary was on the front page of the New York Times. And then as one turned to the back to continue the story, there was the picture. And he told me the following story many times. He said he's running a service. There are survivors there. It's the first time they had a religious service in years. And they're bereft. In the picture, one sees the survivors in their uniforms with the stripes. There are soldiers on the left-hand side. It's gripping. It's in the Kinozala, where the Nazis used to gather to watch movies in the evening. And they have a service, and they're praying to God, and he's saying Kaddish. Could you imagine what that memorial prayer was like for them? They were bawling. They were beside themselves. And then in the middle of the service, somebody yells out from the back, and I'm going to say it in Yiddish, and I'm going to translate it. He said it in Yiddish, and he said, "Und zu welcher Gott davenst die? Zu der Gott, was hat reingeworfen dein Mama and Tata in crematorium? To which God are you praying? You're praying to a God who threw your mother and father into the crematorium." He was beside himself, screaming, disrupting the entire service. You can imagine, there are hundreds of people. They're trying to pray. And there's a jarring, discordant note. What are you doing? Who are you praying to? Who are you kidding? My father was then 27 years old, told me that he stopped. He decided there was nothing he could say to him. So he left where he was in the front, and he walked over, and he gave him a hug. He just gave him a hug. Didn't say a word. And he calmed him down. Maybe it was 20 seconds. It felt like 3 minutes. The man calmed down, was quiet. Everybody was quiet. And my father walked back and resumed the service. It's a very powerful story, but for me, what's powerful and what I want to underscore in this context is that I said to my father, you know what's so special about this story for me? The guy showed up. There were many, many Jews in Buchenwald who gave up, who didn't come to the service. I would say a small percentage of those who were there at that time came. But he came. He came and he was screaming at God within the confines of this prayer service. That's the second category. I'm still in, but I'm really struggling. I'm challenging, I'm yelling. I haven't left, I haven't rejected. I could not have come. Why should I have come? What kind of God is this? But I came, I wanted to be part of the community. And within the confines of that community, I'm screaming to God, and I get embraced by a rabbi who's smart enough to know that he can't say a word. Not a word will make a difference. In the next text, evidence more from Rabbi Shapiro. Rabbi Colonimus Kalman Shapiro continues in a later talk. This one is 1942, when things are really beginning to unravel. And he talks about how people are screaming against God, out to God. It is a marvel how the world exists after so much screaming. When the 10 rabbis martyred by the Romans were suffering, there is a Jewish tradition that in the 2nd century of the Common Era, in the Hadrianic persecutions, 10 great rabbis, one after another, were taken out and martyred. And the rabbis tell us that when that was going on, the ministering angels cried out, Zu Torah v'zu schara, is this Torah and is this a reward? And a voice from heaven said, you better be quiet, because if you're not quiet, the whole world is going to turn into water. The angels are crying when they see this, but yet now spoke Rabbi Shapiro, immaculate children, purest angels, together with the greatest holy Jews, are being murdered and butchered because they're Jews, and they're greater than angels, filling the whole vast emptiness of the universe with their screaming, and the world doesn't turn itself into water. It remains standing steadfast as though God is untouched by these events. He's beside himself. He can't understand this. He challenges, but he challenges from within. It's like a krechts, it's a sigh, it's a cry. God, help me. I'm with you. I'm staying with you. I'm not leaving. I'm still committed. But I can't understand what it is that you, capital Y-O-U, are trying to do. Very much, Rabbi Shapiro, a man of faith. But within the context of that faith, he's asking and he's challenging. I want to move to the final category, to absolute, incredible, rock-solid faith. And before I get to the specific subject of my talk, Jewish religious responses to the Holocaust, I also want to mention that other religions were also challenged. And other religions, Catholics, Christians, others also struggled to maintain faith in God in the face of what was unfolding to them during this time. In July of 2019, an exhibit opened in Auschwitz called Through the Lens of Faith, and I gave you the reference to the website. This was opened at a time in anticipation of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which was liberated in January of 1945. So a couple of months before the 75th anniversary, this exhibition is mounted on the grounds of Auschwitz. You'll go on the website, you'll see exactly what it means. It features testimonies and photographic portraits of 18 Jews, 2 Polish Catholics, and 1 Sinti-free Christian. And you have a text in front of you of Helena Nowinska, who was a Polish Catholic, who writes about her mother. She and her mother were in Birkenau. Her mother was sick and lay untreated in the barracks. She knew she was dying. She turned to me and she said, "Listen to me, child. Give my blessings to the boys, your brothers." My mother had faith. And it gave her power and divine protection, if not here, then in the next world. And so it's clear that all members of all religious traditions were challenged by what it was that was going on, and many of them continued to maintain their faith. My primary focus is on the Jewish community. One of the sources that I consulted is a collection of responsa entitled Mekadshe Hashem, those who sanctify God's name. It was written by a Rabbi Meisels, Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, who was a member of a distinguished Hasidic family, and later on came to the United States. In the preface or the introduction to his work, he tells a story, and you have the text in front of you. I will read parts of it and summarize it. This is Erev Rosh Hashanah in Auschwitz, 1944, the day before Rosh Hashanah. The Nazi commander of Auschwitz determined to keep alive only those boys who could work. And the way to decide if they could work or not was that he put up a bar in a parade ground and had all the boys, 1,600 of them, walk under it. And if their head hit the bar, then they could be alive. If their head did not hit the bar, then they would be killed. 1,400 did not pass the test, and they were all put in one area, no food, no drink. Everybody knew that the next day they were going to be sent to the crematoria. Parents began to realize what was going on. There were capos there who were guarding them. And they went and they begged and they cajoled and they bribed the capos to try to save their son from what they knew would be absolute clear death the next day on Rosh Hashanah. The capo said that we can't do it because the Nazis have a number. And if we let one of these boys go, then we're going to have to take another boy. Maybe a boy who was able to pass the test, maybe another boy. We're going to have to make sure we have that number. So you understand that by freeing your son, you're consigning another child to death. Parents were beside themselves. And at that moment, one of the fathers comes to Rabbi Meisels in Auschwitz, and he asks them a halachic question. Am I allowed? I have the money. The capo told me he would do it. Am I allowed to save my son? Because I know that another person's son is going to be sacrificed. And Rabbi Meisels was simply beside himself. He begged him. You have the text in front of you. You'll read it. Please don't ask me such a question. In the olden days, we needed the high court in Jerusalem to determine matters of life and death. I'm in Auschwitz. I have nothing. I have no books. I have no sources. There's nothing that I could do. But the man insisted. And Rabbi Meisel said, please don't ask me. And then the man said, you know what? I realized that if you thought that I would be allowed to do this, you would have told me. You didn't tell me, which means that I'm not allowed to do this. I accept the will of God. I am not going to ransom my son. Rabbi Meisel said, I didn't tell you you can't. No, you didn't tell me that I can, and therefore I am not going to do it. And all day He's walking around, the father of this son, knowing what's happening to his child. And it's Rosh Hashanah. And on Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year, we read the story of the Akedah, the story of Abraham bringing his son Isaac to be sacrificed at the top of Mount Moriah. And this man says, I want my son to be in the same category of Isaac, sacrificed by his father. He accepts the will of God, and he does so willingly. This is incomprehensible to understand. He asks a halachic question of a rabbi. The rabbi begs him, don't ask me, I'm not telling you what to do. And the man says, you didn't tell me it's okay? This is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to act. Faced with the greatest challenge. Faced with the greatest challenge to one's faith. This is the third category, continue to maintain one's faith. All in, committed, believing in God, in spite of the greatest tragedies. I have here for you a list of the kinds of issues that were raised by regular, straightforward, committed Jews to rabbis during the war. We're now during the war. Can one hasten one's death? Is suicide justified? Can one pose as a Christian to save oneself? Can one do an abortion? Is it permitted? What are the priorities as to who gets rescued? Who comes first if only a few people could get rescued? Are we allowed to compromise somehow, and what can compromises look like in observance of the Sabbath and the holidays? What about non-kosher food? What is the correct text? This is an amazing one on the blessing of martyrdom. There's a blessing before one does a ritual act, well, martyrdom, kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. I know that I'm going to be sanctifying God's name. I want to make sure I get the blessing, the text of the blessing right. Can one recite the morning blessing, thanking God for not making me a slave? In the morning prayer, there are a series of blessings. One of them is Shelo Asani Aved, not making me, thank you God, not making me a slave, but I am a slave. But I am a slave. Can I make that blessing? Look at the level of the questions that these people are asking. I want to frame these different categories in the context of a Talmudic passage which you have here before you in Tractate Sanhedrin. You have the original text from the Talmud and also the English translation. Rabbi Eliezer said, the context here is what happened to those who were resurrected by the prophet Ezekiel. The Bible tells us that Ezekiel came into a field and there were dry bones, and slowly he put them together step by step by step by step, and they became human beings. The sinews and the veins, and then the skin and the bones, and then humanity. From bones, they became human beings, and that's where the story ends, and the Talmud wants to know what happened next. Rabbi Eliezer said that the dead who were resurrected by Ezekiel stood on their feet, they uttered songs, and then they died. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, says, the dead who Ezekiel resurrected went to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, and they married, and they had families. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Beseira, stood up and said, I am one of their descendants, and these are the tefillin, the phylacteries, that my grandfather left for me. There are three categories here. One is the dead who are resurrected, and I see this in the context of those Jews who went through, who survived the Holocaust, based on their experiences during the Holocaust. One category of Jews got up, said thank you, and they left. They left. They could no longer be involved with Jewish tradition, with Jewish people. They could no longer hitch their wagon to the caravan of Jewish destiny. They had it, and they left. And we don't judge them. We understand them. That was the first category. And then there's the second category, that they had faith, not necessarily in God, but in the Jewish people. They went to Israel. They went to the State of Israel. They helped found the State of Israel. When the State of Israel was founded in May of 1948, there were 600,000 Jews. Roughly 25% were Holocaust survivors. And they created families. And they lived a life of Jewish nationalism. And then the third category, which is our last category, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, my Zaidi, my grandfather, left me the tefillin. The tefillin, the phylacteries, a ritual object, and here they are. I'm holding on to those objects in spite of what it was that my grandparents and what I also experienced. I'm still connected. I'm still part of the Jewish people, and I'm still part of Jewish tradition. And the Shabbat candles, and the Hanukkah menorah, and the Seder plate. In spite of everything that happened, I'm engaged, and I'm still committed. I conclude with a passage from Emil Fackenheim, a very, very prominent Holocaust theologian, in a book that he wrote in 1970 called God's Presence in History. And Fackenheim is known for this phrase, this very significant and important phrase: Jews are forbidden to hand Hitler posthumous victories. They are commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. You see, he says, if Jews give up, we're just doing what Hitler wanted us to do, to just get rid of the Jewish people. We are forbidden to hand Hitler a posthumous victory. Jews are commanded to remember the victims of Auschwitz, lest their memory perish. They're forbidden to despair of man and his world. And finally, they are forbidden to despair of the God of Israel, lest Judaism perish. A secularist Jew cannot make himself believe by a mere act of will. A religious Jew who stayed with God may be forced into new and maybe revolutionary relationships with God. One possibility, says Fackenheim, is wholly unthinkable. A Jew may not respond to Hitler's attempt to destroy Judaism by himself cooperating in its destruction. Very, very powerful, powerful words. We don't judge at all the various reactions. We don't judge someone. I don't know what I would have done were I in such a circumstance. We don't judge. But all the power to those who are able to hold on to the tefillin and to continue to maintain their faith. The Jewish religious responses to the Holocaust are multifaceted, and there is evidence for all of them. And what I suggested to you or provided for you today was only a little tiny taste of the different possibilities. Going forward, we pray that humanity should learn the lesson of the Holocaust. And all of us, all peoples, good peoples everywhere, should work to ensure that peoples all over the world should be treated with the respect and with the dignity that they and we all deserve.